Well, I'll just tell you what I really think to start with. But yeah, more or less, I mean this literally. Have any of you ever seen, say, litter by the side of the road, didn't want to pick it up because, ew, gross, nasty? Bad news for you. Because you didn't clean it up then and throw it away, probably touching just the tips of your fingers, you straight up drank it.
Oh no.
Because it broke down into tiny little particles that then went downstream into the ocean, and when the water evaporated, it went back up into the tundras that become the drinking water that came out of your tap. And unfortunately, those don't get filtered out. They're known as microplastics. What is a microplastic? Tiny particles of plastic that can be 5 millimeters or smaller. Some of them have been even measured in the microns, like Wookie was talking about. In fact, some of these, he talked about the nanoscopic particles that are in the air. Now I'm going to tell you about what's in your water. As you can see, some of these microplastics, here's the really twisted thing. Some of these microplastics that then become what we consume are intentionally put in our products. And they're made from fibers, and they're made from literally everything that sheds everything made from plastic sheds microplastics. Now, not all plastic is bad, by the way. There are certain ones that are made from like starches, like PLA, that dissolve completely in stomach acid. Where I'm more worried about the one on your right, my left. That is lingers for pretty much ever. It's completely indestructible. Some previous studies have even shown that only 7% of it dissolves when it's stuck in straight up hydrochloric acid. Which means some of it is still just straight up stuck in your system, is not going to be broken down. It comes from, like I said, literally everywhere. And as mentioned before, anything made from plastic sheds microplastics. Some of them are in the landfill, and when you throw something away made of plastic, that becomes particles, and next time it rains, those run down into the stream and into the ocean. But again, the environment basically just vomits them back up into the tundra, and they end up in your drinking water. And that's actually what I found. This is actually a photo I took while examining microplastics under microscopes. The total surface area of the circle or oval, as the distorted image may show, in diameter is 0.67 millimeters for reference. And as it says, image is shown at 1,000 times 1,500 times magnification. Blah, I'm tripping over myself today. But wait, there's more. There's also nanoplastics. This is the same size reference, by the way. The total from here to here is 0.67 millimeters. So small you can't even use a ruler to measure it. And all those little particles, every last one of those is pieces of plastic that have broken down in the tundra. Of course, you're wondering, how do I find these? Because there's a little thing that gets in the way sometimes, and how do I know that's not phytoplankton? That's because that's a phytoplankton. You can actually see a green vein in them, and you can actually see that there's more phytoplankton starting to grow off of that one. But the thing that really gets underfoot and has been a thorn in my side during this entire research is the zooplankton on your right. There can be millions, if not billions, if not trillions of these things in a single sample that I got to get rid of. So, especially since to get these microplastics, what I use is literally called a zooplankton net. And there's so many in the tundra that it actually clogs the net. So what I have to do is I put it in a glass jar as a sample and cover it with a tinfoil lid so that, say, a plastic lid doesn't contaminate my sample and give me a false positive, because everything, even this little thing I'm touching right now, as I rub up against it, it's shedding microplastics. And then we put it into what's known as a digest, where it sits. Original versions of the experiment did 24 hours with 10% potassium hydroxide, a very strong base. But we found that's not nearly enough because there's just so much zooplankton. Because the idea is we dissolve the zooplankton, and because of what I mentioned before, the plastic we're really worried about is still there. So instead, we did anywhere between 72 hours to a week with 20% to 40% of the total mass of the sample in potassium hydroxide. And then, of course, I looked at it under a microscope. Previous versions of the experiment only used 40 times magnification, but as you saw, that's probably not nearly enough to find the smaller particles. So that may have skewed the data when trying to quantify them as well, making it look like you're drinking way, way, way fewer microplastics than you really are. Because 40 times can only get things that can still be seen by the naked eye, unfortunately. And of course, that's another photo of yet another microplastic I found through that process. The locations I sampled, there were actually 3 of them. The natural waterways I sampled were from Niwot Ridge in the Green Lake Valley, which, according to the city of Boulder, is where 40% of your drinking water comes from. I sampled a stream to see whether or not they're actually going downstream, but just dropping it in, and that thing pulled harder than any fish I've ever been fishing for. And then we also sampled Green Lake 1. And then I also sampled the filtered tap water in the lab. Oh, that's a fun part. I learned yesterday that was the filtered water. And by the way, I gotta warn you, this next graph is very, 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 very skewed because those 2 samples on the farthest right, the natural samples, are actually a condensed form of the plastics from like running 1,000 gallons through the net. This is a straight up 100 milliliter, actually no, microliter sample straight from the tap. And as you can see, we already found in just the straight up 100 microliters from the filtered water, there was well, I'll confess, it took so long that on all those samples, we just started testing a centimeter of the evenly spread 100 microliter film on the slide. And even then, I was at 182 on the, so there's probably even more than that in the 100 microliter sample, if you want to do the math on how many microplastics and nanoplastics you're consuming per day. And not only was it the greatest quantity, it was also the biggest mass. The average size of them was also the largest in the water filters. As it turns out, want to know one of the reasons for that? 3 guesses as to what your filter's made out of. First 2 don't count.
No.
Your filters, if you buy one of those filters that's supposed to make your water even cleaner than it comes from the tap, that's made of plastic. So it's actually basically artificially injecting microplastics into your water if you buy something from like pure water filters. So, of course, originally I was saying this is the thing, but unfortunately they collect in our bodies through a process known as bioaccumulation because our body currently doesn't have any known way of purging them. And I'll have to test to see if it's actually purging them in a future study, as Dana suggested. But so far, nada, they're just accumulating. They're even accumulating in some people before they're even born, is what I just learned yesterday. Talk about a real-life eldritch horror. So originally I was going to suggest a filter, but on second thought, that will be probably a future work that I'm going to need to work on, is screwing around and finding out if a filter gets them out rather than adds them in. But of course, there were a few limitations to this and a few assumptions I had to make. One of the limitations is that, of course, it's either coming from upstream or it's coming from the filter. But there's another enemy to this. Guess what we use to transfer our water?
Is it plastic?
Plastic. This is a PVC pipe from our sewage ways. And we also use PVC pipe to hook up those water fountains to our main waterways. And we also use plastic in the filtration centers. Wherefore, everything is putting massive amounts, and that's one of the reasons we're probably finding way higher levels than we do in nature, even though we're talking about how much it's infiltrating. It's interesting. Everywhere except our drinking water, when I initially started, had been tested, and all the natural ways, like save the fish, save the bears, save the moose, whatever from what you've seen so far, how about a little save ourselves? Because it's almost like, and I was actually straight up told by some scientists they were afraid to know the answer.
Yeah.
They were afraid to know whether or not this was the case, and unfortunately it was. I think deep down part of us knew. So of course next steps would try to figure out a way, because I know how to dissolve the plankton to find the microplastics. So far I'm really curious, is there something I could do to do the opposite? Dissolve the plastics without hurting the plankton. Because if you can do that, you can do that on the microscopic organisms. Maybe you can do that on the macroscopic ones, like humans. But of course, we got to figure out where their origins are. Like I said, one of the biggest, worst offenders I've found is those disposable plastic water bottles. Or plastic tea. Or apparently one of the worst offenders are Pepsi and Coca-Cola. Because they use polyethylene terephthalate, the PET plastic I mentioned before that's so hard to dispose of, breaks down in the environment, lasts pretty much forever. They use it without remorse. But so does Nestle with literally any wrapper they make. But then finally, I found out one other source recently that I hadn't originally included that can be a source of microplastics. You might be drinking cigarette filters. So, yeah, that's what we're finding. And currently, aside from a few initial experiments on, say, red blood cells and whatnot, we don't actually have a good idea of what they're doing to us. And of course, first rule of toxicology, poison's in the dose. So we don't know what the danger is in the dose. We don't know what the dangerous dose is yet, and what it does to us even. Aside from some initial things may show it may be both a carcinogen and just a straight up toxin that keeps oxygen from getting to our red blood cells at the same time. But we don't know if we have an adaptation to that or not. So that's one of the other things, probably for someone who's more in the medical research and medical engineering field to look into than me. It's beyond my scope, or my microscope. Even though it can do 1,500 times magnification. Because I don't have the expertise to do that, someone who actually has health research experience should probably be looking into what these things are doing, especially since we're consuming them probably more than we consumed lead in previous generations. Just because there's so much sheds. This is a completely incomplete acknowledgement slide. Special thanks to Samuel Nievek, who's in the back, my mentor. Leah Terry for helping me through this. Who's actually up next, Salome Carrasco, right next to Leah. All the RECCS mentors, and of course the RECCS program itself series, and you've probably seen, some of this is getting kind of repetitive by the time I'm at the end of this anyway. So. And then finally, these were the sources used. For further reading on the topic, I recommend all the following sources if you want to take a screenshot, if you don't want to take a photo with your phone.
That was good. Okay, quick question.
I had a quick question. So you talk about the microplastics come out in our tap water.
Mm-hmm.
And you guys are taking samples from lakes and everything.
Mm-hmm.
Do you guys do any or post samples of the water treatment facility to see the difference in the...
Unfortunately, we were never got the chance to.
Do you think there would be a difference?
I don't know. I'll have to look into that next and test that next.